I never thought a busted sewer easement would become the most valuable thing I owned, but that's exactly what happened. 96 luxury condos were sending every flush, every shower, every load of laundry through a pipe buried beneath my backyard, and for nearly a decade they acted like it belonged to them. The funny part is, they probably would have gotten away with it forever if they hadn't sent city inspectors to paint little orange marks across my fence one cold Tuesday morning. My name is Mason Barrett. I'm 49 years old, and I've been a union plumber in Philadelphia for more than 25 years. I don't wear expensive watches. I don't own vacation homes, and I don't know the first thing about wine tastings or rooftop cocktail parties. My world is pipe wrenches, crawl spaces, busted water heaters, and people calling me at 6 in the morning because something is leaking where it shouldn't. I live in the same little brick house my wife and I bought almost 20 years ago, tucked between an old machine shop and what used to be a textile warehouse before developers decided every abandoned building in the neighborhood needed to become luxury living. My driveway is cracked. My chain-link fence leans a little farther every winter, and the smell of wet concrete after rain somehow still reminds me of my dad, who taught me plumbing before arthritis forced him to retire. Right next door sits Harbor Point Residences, 12 stories of polished glass and steel where condos start somewhere around $1.4 million. Every morning, I'd watch people step into black SUVs wearing clothes that probably cost more than my pickup truck, while I'd climb into muddy boots wondering which basement was flooding today. I never envied them. Money doesn't bother me. Arrogance does. That Tuesday started like any other. I grabbed coffee from the corner deli, waved at old Mr. Alvarez sweeping his sidewalk, and noticed 3 city workers standing beside my fence with clipboards and fluorescent paint. At first I figured another utility company wanted to dig up half the street again. It happens more often than you'd think. But when I walked over and asked what was going on, one of the inspectors looked down at his paperwork and casually said, "We're verifying an existing sewer easement before some maintenance work." The word easement caught my attention immediately. Plumbers notice words other people ignore. I asked if I could see the paperwork, and after a second of hesitation, he handed me the work order. I only needed about 10 seconds before something started itching in the back of my mind. According to the documents, Harbor Point's entire wastewater system had been connected through an easement crossing my property. 8 years. 8 years, and somehow nobody had ever mentioned it to me. I smiled politely, thanked the inspector, then spent the rest of the day pretending to work while my brain refused to let it go. That night, I climbed into my basement, dug through dusty filing cabinets left by the previous owner, and eventually found a weathered folder containing property surveys going back decades. Around midnight, I found exactly what I was looking for. The original easement dated back to 1954. It wasn't for a luxury condominium. It wasn't even close. It authorized sewer access for 3 small row houses that no longer existed. 3 houses. That's it. I sat there staring at the faded blueprint for a long time, running numbers in my head without even realizing it. 3 homes might generate a manageable amount of wastewater. 96 luxury condos filled with families, dishwashers, washing machines, oversized bathtubs, and every other convenience imaginable. That wasn't just different. It was an entirely different universe. The next morning, I called an old friend named Ethan Cole, one of the best civil engineers I'd ever worked with. Ethan wasn't the kind of guy who jumped to conclusions. He measured everything twice before speaking once. When I explained what I'd found, he paused for a few seconds before saying, "Don't touch anything yet. Let's find out exactly what you've got." For the next several days, we mapped every accessible section of the underground system using old city records, cameras, locating equipment, and enough coffee to keep a small army awake. Every new piece of information made the picture clearer, and somehow even more unbelievable. Every main sewer line leaving Harbor Point merged into a single 12-inch pipe before crossing directly beneath the back corner of my lot. There were 2 routes. There wasn't a backup line. There wasn't some hidden municipal bypass. Everything passed through one place, my property. Ethan finally folded the survey map, looked at me over the hood of my truck, and quietly said, "Mason, if these records are right, you don't just own part of the system. You own the only choke point they've got." I laughed at first because it sounded ridiculous, like something out of a movie, but neither of us was laughing 5 minutes later. Standing in my backyard, looking at nothing more exciting than a patch of cracked asphalt and patchy grass, I realized the most expensive building in the neighborhood depended completely on a piece of infrastructure everyone had forgotten existed. except now someone had remembered. And for the first time in my life, I started wondering why a building full of lawyers, developers, and wealthy investors had worked so hard to make sure a plumber never asked a single question about the pipe buried under his own land. Type P2 when you're ready for the next part. Mason, if these records are right, you don't just own part of the system, you own the only choke point they've got. Ethan's words echoed in my head all weekend. I kept looking out the kitchen window toward Harbor Point, watching people walk tiny designer dogs, carrying grocery bags from organic markets, smiling like life couldn't possibly surprise them anymore. They had no idea that every time someone upstairs flushed a toilet, the waste traveled through a pipe buried beneath the patch of grass where my granddaughter liked to chase fireflies during summer cookouts. The strange thing wasn't that I felt powerful. It was that I felt responsible. Plumbing teaches you something most people never think about. Civilization is just a series of invisible systems doing their jobs. Electricity, water, gas, sewage. Nobody notices any of them until one stops working. And once one fails, all the money in the world can't make it disappear overnight. Monday morning, Ethan and I met with a real estate attorney named Claire Donovan. She specialized in easement disputes, the kind of lawyer who rarely raised her voice because she never needed to. She spent almost an hour studying every document we collected before finally removing her glasses and asking one question. Did anyone ever request permission to expand this easement? I shook my head. Did anyone compensate you or the previous owners? Another no. She leaned back in her chair, smiled ever so slightly, and said, "Well, someone has a very expensive problem." That sentence changed everything. Claire explained that the original easement had very specific language. It granted limited access for 3 residential dwellings connected to infrastructure existing in the 1950s. Harbor Point wasn't an updated version of those homes. It was an entirely different use. Bigger capacity, greater burden, greater maintenance risk, different legal obligations. Somewhere along the line, developers had apparently assumed nobody would ever read the original paperwork. They gambled that old documents sitting in dusty filing cabinets stayed forgotten forever. Unfortunately for them, they were dealing with a plumber whose entire career depended on reading things other people ignored. We decided to move carefully. No threats, no dramatic social media videos, no television reporters, just facts. The first thing I did was hire a licensed contractor to excavate the access point sitting legally inside my property line. Everything was permitted, everything inspected, everything documented with photographs and video. We installed a brand new industrial shutoff valve rated for municipal systems, bright stainless steel, heavy enough that 4 men had to lower it into place. Watching that valve disappear into the ground felt oddly surreal. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't revenge. It was simply control over equipment sitting on land that belonged to me. Claire mailed a formal notice requesting a meeting with Harbor Point's condominium association. 3 days later, I received a phone call from a man introducing himself as Preston Langford, president of the board. His voice carried that polished confidence people develop after years of believing every conversation ends their way. "Mr. Barrett," he said pleasantly, "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. I'd be happy to stop by and clear everything up." "Tomorrow morning," I answered. 9 o'clock. He arrived exactly on time, driving a silver European sedan that probably cost twice what my house stayed when I bought it. Perfect navy suit, expensive shoes that somehow never seemed to touch dirt. He stepped out smiling, the kind of smile designed for charity galas and magazine photos. "Mr. Barrett," he said while extending his hand, "please call me Preston." I shook it. "Most people call me Mason." We sat at my old picnic table behind the garage. Birds were chirping. My neighbor's radio played classic rock somewhere over the fence. It couldn't have looked less like the beginning of a 6-figure legal dispute. Preston spent the first 10 minutes complimenting the neighborhood, talking about revitalization, investment, rising property values. Finally, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Look, if someone forgot paperwork years ago, we certainly don't want hard feelings." Then he slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $20,000. "A goodwill gesture," he said. "Let's avoid unnecessary complications." I looked at the check for a few seconds before placing 3 folders in front of him instead. Folder 1 contained the original easement. Folder 2 contained Ethan's engineering report mapping every sewer connection. Folder 3 contained an invoice totaling $680,000, representing unauthorized commercial use, engineering costs, property impact, And retroactive access fees calculated by Claire's office. Preston actually laughed. Not nervous laughter. Genuine amusement. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You can't possibly believe this number, I shrugged. Whether you believe it isn't really the issue. You're trying to extort us. No, I answered calmly. I'm asking to be compensated for something your building has been using without permission for years. He tapped the invoice with one finger. You'll never collect this. I stood up without saying another word. Come with me. We walked across the backyard toward the fresh concrete access box. I unlocked the steel cover, lifted it open, and revealed the gleaming shut-off assembly below. Preston stared down into the vault. What's this? That's the only valve controlling every sewer line leaving Harbor Point before it reaches the municipal main. His smile disappeared. You're bluffing. Ethan stepped forward carrying rolled engineering drawings. Actually, he's not. He spread the plans across the tailgate of my truck, pointing to every branch feeding into the single collector. Preston's eyes followed the lines in silence. I could almost hear the math happening inside his head. 96 condos, hundreds of residents, one outlet, one valve, one property owner. Finally, he looked back at me. You wouldn't dare. I met his eyes. I haven't turned anything yet, have I? The next morning, Claire called laughing softly. Their lawyers finally read the easement. By lunchtime, I received the first legal threat. They claimed interference, bad faith, abuse of property rights, intentional economic harm. Claire dictated a 2-page response that politely dismantled every argument using their own construction records. The easement authorized 3 residences. Harbor Point operated 96 luxury units. Capacity exceeded the original agreement several dozen times over. Additional burden required new consent that had never been obtained. Every citation was attached. Every photograph labeled. Every engineering calculation verified. 48 hours later, their tone changed completely. Instead of threats, they requested negotiations. Claire advised patience. They're buying time, she told me. They've finally realized the engineering problem is worse than the legal one. She was right. Through public records, we learned rerouting the entire building to another municipal connection would require tearing up 3 city blocks, relocating utilities, obtaining environmental permits, and spending somewhere around $2.5 million before the first shovel even touched the ground. Worse yet, construction would take nearly a year. Harbor Point's board couldn't quietly hide a special assessment that large from nearly 100 condo owners. Residents would demand answers. Banks financing the association would start asking questions. Insurance companies would get involved. Suddenly, my little brick house wasn't sitting next to a luxury building anymore. It was sitting next to a financial time bomb. A week later, we met again. This time in a downtown conference room overlooking the skyline. Preston looked different. Same expensive suit, but now the confidence had small cracks running through it. Beside him sat 3 attorneys, 2 engineers, and an accountant who hadn't smiled once since entering the room. Claire opened by saying only one sentence. We're prepared to solve your problem today. For the next 3 hours, everyone argued numbers, maintenance obligations, inspection rights, future liability, emergency procedures, environmental compliance, and payment schedules. Voices rose. Tempers flared. At one point, Preston slammed both hands on the table. Do you understand what this will cost us politically? Claire didn't even blink. Do you understand what ignoring property rights for 8 years has already cost my client? Silence filled the room. Eventually, the accountant whispered something into Preston's ear. His shoulders dropped just enough for everyone to notice. That's when I knew the fight had shifted. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying to survive. Type P3 when you're ready for the final part. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying to survive. And funny enough, that realization took every ounce of anger out of me. I'd spent weeks imagining how satisfying this moment would feel, watching the people who had looked down on me finally admit they had a problem they couldn't buy their way out of. But sitting there across that polished conference table, all I really saw were people scrambling to fix a mistake that should have never happened in the first place. Claire slid a revised agreement across the table without saying a word. Preston picked it up, read every page slowly, then looked directly at me for the first time since we'd walked into the room. If we sign this, he asked quietly, does this end today? I nodded. It ends the legal fight. Whether it ends the lesson is up to you. He let out a long breath before reaching for his pen. The agreement required Harbor Point to pay $680,000 within 30 days as compensation for 8 years of unauthorized use. then enter into a 40-year licensed access agreement with monthly payments for continued use of the line. Every inspection would happen on my schedule with proper notice. Every repair caused by excess load would be paid by the association, and if they missed a payment or violated the agreement, I retained the legal right to suspend access after following the procedures outlined in the contract. Nobody smiled when the last signature hit the paper. It wasn't that kind of victory. It felt more like watching a fire finally burn itself out after threatening to take down an entire neighborhood. 3 weeks later, the wire transfer landed in my account. I stared at the balance on my phone for a long time before logging the screen and climbing back underneath a leaking restaurant sink I promised to fix that afternoon. My apprentice looked at me like I was crazy. You know, he laughed. Most people would have taken the day off. I tightened the last fitting, wiped my hands on an old shop towel, and shrugged. Bills don't stop because your bank account gets bigger. He laughed, but I wasn't joking. That money changed my future. Sure, my wife and I finally paid off the mortgage. We replaced the roof we'd been patching every winter. We set up college funds for the grandkids and donated new plumbing equipment to the vocational school where my father had once taught evening classes. But the best part wasn't the money. It was waking up every morning knowing nobody had quietly taken something that belonged to my family anymore. About 2 months after everything was finalized, I scheduled my first contractual inspection. Harbor Point's lobby looked exactly the same as always. Polished marble floors, fresh flowers, a piano that nobody ever seemed to play. But the atmosphere felt completely different. The concierge greeted me by name before I even reached the desk. "Good morning, Mr. Barrett. Engineering is expecting you." That was new. Respect has a funny way of showing up once contracts replace assumptions. As I walked toward the service elevator, I spotted Preston standing near the mailboxes talking with another board member. He looked up, recognized me instantly, then hesitated for just a second before walking over. "Morning, Mason." "Morning." There was an awkward silence between us before he finally smiled. Not the polished smile from our first meeting, but the kind that comes after someone has been humbled by reality. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've started reading every easement before approving construction projects." I couldn't help laughing. "That's probably cheaper." Even he laughed at that. We shook hands, and for the first time, it actually felt genuine. On my way home, I stopped by my father's old cemetery, something I hadn't planned to do. I stood there thinking about all the years he spent teaching me that the people who build and maintain the things nobody notices are usually the ones holding entire communities together. He used to say, "Son, everybody looks up at skyscrapers. Nobody looks down at the pipes until they're standing in sewage." Back then, I thought it was just another one of Dad's old trade jokes. Turns out it was one of the smartest lessons he ever gave me. Every neighborhood has people who think power comes from money, titles, expensive offices, or the view from the penthouse. Sometimes it does, but every now and then power belongs to the quiet guy, covered in grease, who spent 30 years learning exactly how the invisible parts of the world work. That's the part of this story people argue about whenever I tell it. Some say I should have simply accepted the $20,000 and moved on. Others think I should have shut the valve the moment I discovered what had happened. Personally, I think neither would have been right. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was protecting property rights and making sure the rules applied equally whether someone lived in a modest brick house or a $1 million condo overlooking the skyline. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered an entire luxury building had been using your property for years without permission, would you have taken the quick payout, fought for every dollar, or handled it differently? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And if you enjoy real-world conflicts where ordinary people stand their ground against powerful organizations, make sure you stick around, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes the little guy never wins.